Hi there, Carl Boltzmann here, and welcome back to my studio. In this video, I'm going to be deconstructing and talking about one of my favorite songs, Stress, from the band Justice, which was released in 2007 on the Cross album. Like I mentioned earlier, that is one of my favorite songs of all time. And it can be difficult to describe why a song is good or why it might even be great. But you can certainly say that some of the best music ever might have an unforgettable hook. Or maybe the vocalist has such a performance that it literally gives you shivers. Or once in a while, the songwriting is so unique and so interesting that you actually remember where you were when you first heard that track. But in the case of Stress, none of those things are really present. It doesn't have a hook in the traditional sense. It obviously doesn't have a vocal line that's going to give you shivers. And overall, the general songwriting and structure of the song is way above average. It's fantastic. But it's not on the level of something that would change the game. Well, at least for me, the reason why Stress is such a unique and interesting track, and one of my favorites, is because of the risks that they took on the mix. It is unlike anything that I've heard before or since, and it's such a unique thing to have a mix be essentially the hook of the track. Stress just rides that fine line between a little bit of pain and torture. It's always reminded me a little bit like a very spicy hot sauce. You don't need it on something, but when you're in the right mood, it will take your food or your evening or your day to a different level. And that is what Stress does for me. And the only reason it does that is because of the mix. Let me know in the comments if you guys can think of another track where the hook is essentially the mix. I'm always on the hunt for interesting mixes, so I'd love to hear that. Anyway, let's talk about where that amazing intro string sample came from. So the first sample that we hear in Stress has an origin that I never would have guessed in a million years. If you own an Apple MacBook or computer of some sort, you likely have a video editor called iMovie. Inside iMovie, they have sound effects and other things. And this main sample comes from that sample library pack. And I'm sure you've heard them before on YouTube and different videos. But that sample comes from iLife Sound Effects, Suspense Accents 06, from iMovie Sound Effects. So it's the one right at the beginning, and first of all, it's pitched down, I believe, by 2 semitones. So what we're going to do here is we're going to cut up the sound to give it that hard staccato sound. And then we're going to have to add some compressors and things to really bring out that harshness. So here's the second note. And so what they did is they just let the note all the way through. And they just cut in between each to give it that staccato sound. And then we're going to just keep going through here. It will never cease to amaze me that this track that I cherish so much used a sample from the iMovie sample library. But they did it in such a sneaky good way that you really have to respect it. You know, it doesn't really matter where your samples come from. It's about what you do with them. So this is what I've ended up with. Now, this is not a mixing tutorial on how to make something sound like Justice, but I am going to talk a little bit about it. But I can't say for certain what they would have done. All I know is that they pushed whatever tools they were using to their max. And there would have been a number of different tools. There's some talk out there that Justice's sound, and same thing with Daft Punk, came from the Alesis 3630 compressor. I can pretty much guarantee that the rumors that that is the only thing they used is false. And there's just no way, because the sound is so complicated, and if it was as simple as just using an Alesis 3630, there would be plenty of demonstrations of people doing that out there, and there aren't. And there aren't because what they did was a multitude of different things. Anyway, so on to the point here. What I've done on the main bus of these strings is I've EQ'd them, so I've taken out a lot of the bass. I've thrown in a compressor, and I have an auto pan, which is doing a subtle left to right pan. And then I've also included a slight reverb as well, which you can probably hear. Now let's get on to the next sample. And those amazing sounds come to us from David Shire and their track Night on Disco Mountain from the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. This track always takes me back to OAC art class. A buddy of mine used to bring in the record all the time. And it was either DMX being played or the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. In either way, it made for a pretty fantastic atmosphere. Now, this sample isn't super complicated at all. So we're going to bring up the pitch. So we're going to bring up the pitch by 3 semitones. And then what we're going to do is we're going to cut off the loop here right as the next bass drum comes in. And then we're going to consolidate that so that now we have a loop here and we can work with that. And so one of the things I'm going to do is we're going to turn the warping onto complex. Then I'm going to click down here with the transients at the bottom. And I'm going to click Command A to select all. And then Command U, which will give me access to the transients. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move these bass drums right into place. And then we get this. And then I'm going to chop off the tail at the end. And then we're just going to duplicate the last 2 hits here and see how this sounds. And you can hear how it kind of has a natural sidechain breathiness to it. But if we listen to that compared to Stress, I'm not feeling very stressed here when I hear this. So what I've done to replicate this is a few things. I've split up the highs and the lows. And so we have the highs. And we have the lows. And the reason I've done that is so that I can separate the volume of the two. We have some extreme EQs, and we have some sidechain compressors that will come up later as more instruments come in, like the drums. So in this case, when the bass drum gets played, it's going to activate a compressor that is on the main bus of these strings, and it's going to lower the volume of the strings for a split second, and it's going to give it a kind of breathiness. And you can look up how to sidechain in Ableton. It's very easy. It's right on the compressor down here. You see a sidechain option. Anyway, there's plenty of tutorials out there on how to do that. The other thing I've done is I've basically gone crazy with compressors and limiters here. And also, just to be warned, if you're going to do this kind of thing, let me highly recommend that you put a limiter on your master bus so that in case if something goes wrong, in case if you accidentally turn off a limiter somewhere or a compressor or something, so that you don't hurt your ears or your equipment. So here's the high and the low separated. Now, when we get to the halfway point of these bars, they bring in the hi-hat shimmer from the first bass drum hit of Night on Disco Mountain. And that gives it kind of a high cymbal crash noise. Now, you can't talk about Justice and not talk about the drums. Now, they've said in the past that they used hundreds of micro samples on this album, and I have no doubt that that is true. And so an example that they give was using the snare from 50 Cent's Into Club on their track Genesis. Go, 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 shawty. And so that snare would sound like this as a micro sample. And I encourage you to go listen to Genesis by Justice. And it is identifiable because of the way that Dr. Dre staggered the clap hits. There's a clap hit that hits a little bit early, and you can see it in the transients right there. So this is where the beat lands, where the big transient is. But there's a clap just before that. Go, 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 go. And you can hear that in Genesis. And so clearly they did use it, which is kind of cool. But they did that all over the place. So they would have taken samples from anything and everything. But after doing a lot of comparisons, I think that the main drums that they used were from the Linn drum machine. So that's what I based my drums off of. So let's hear what we have. And so after doing this deconstruction, I'm quite confident that there is a combination of samples going on. But without knowing exactly what those are, this is the closest that we can come. But I will say that there's a couple little mixing details I'm going to point out here. There's a couple different ways of doing this. But in Ableton Live, you can have an effects rack and have multiple effects chains in parallel. And so what I've done here on the snare, we have a snare that has a reverb that is only high end. And it's sidechained to the bass drum. So when we put those two things together, it lets it breathe a little bit. And Justice definitely did this. Obviously, they did it better than I could. But there are a number of examples of side chaining going on here, where samples kind of come in and out of existence depending on another sample being played. And you can hear that in the drums, and it happens a little bit here too. Like at the end of this bar, the hi-hat plays, and that is side chained to the rest of the drums for the rest of the drums to shut up, basically, when this hi-hat plays. And same thing with this backwards snare. It's a slight thing, but what it does is it allows those samples to pop out because you're taking the volume of the other samples down for that microsecond that you might not even notice. And those are some of the mixing details that I can't stress enough would have taken a long time for them to kind of master and get down to make this sound. So let's compare that to what I have. That's them. Let's move on to the last sample that we know about. Those sirens are brought to us by the always amazing DEVO and their track Jocko Homo from their 1977 album Q Are We Not Men? A We Are DEVO. So there's really not very much done with this sample. It's not even pitch shifted. but I will say that they added some reverb, and just look at this EQ down here. And part of it might be the rip that I'm using, and they very likely reamped this, which would change the EQ entirely. But the EQs to try to replicate some of the sounds on this track are just outrageous. No one under regular circumstances would use an EQ like that. But I'll show you the difference. So that concludes my exploration of the track Stress by Justice, one of my favorite songs of all time. What do you guys think? What is your favorite song from the Cross album? Let me know in the comments. And on that note, I hope you have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.